Jim Welch, of course, needs no introduction here in Lewiston, Idaho. For at least 15 years, Jim has been a frequent campus visitor. He published his first book, Writing the Earth Boy 40, recently reprinted, I should add, in a modest but distinguished edition. In 1971, his first novel, Winter in the Blood, in 1974. 3 more novels have followed. The Death of Jim Loney, 1979, Fool's Crow, 1986, and Indian Lawyer, released just a few months ago. Although Jim Welch's honors and awards are far too numerous to list here, I want to mention a couple of them at least. The Theodore Roethke Chair at the University of Washington, 3 Pacific Northwest Bookseller Awards, an American Book Award, and a Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Until recently, Jim served on the Montana State Board of Pardons. At a time when our college is celebrating Native American awareness and Dances with Wolves is sweeping the Oscars and making favor with moviegoers across the nation, it is a pleasure to bring to campus one of the most powerful novelists in America who also happens to be Indian. Or perhaps I should rephrase the matter this way. It is a pleasure to bring to campus an Indian who also happens to be one of the most powerful novelists in America. Ladies and gentlemen, James Welch.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I do have, as Jim mentioned, lots of ties here. A lot of good people who teach here are friends of mine, and so it's always a real treat to come to Lewiston. And also, it's a beautiful drive over from Missoula. So that was kind of a bonus, even though the path was a bit iffy today, surprisingly. I thought what I'd do is read a few poems to begin with. I'm just recovering from a cold, so I hope my voice holds out during the course of this reading. I thought I'd read a few poems from my recently republished book of poems by James Hepworth's book from Confluence Press, and then read a section from my latest novel, The Indian Lawyer. The first poem I'd like to read is called Arizona Highways. Once I went to Arizona, and Arizona and New Mexico did a series of readings down there. And during the course of visiting some schools on a Navajo reservation, I came to one school called Fort Wingate. And it was a kind of boarding school campus affair. And some of the teachers told me they had this really bright girl in their classes, and they wanted her to go on to college. And would I mind having lunch with her in this massive dining room and talk to her about college to try to convince her that that would be a good thing to do. So I sat across from her and we talked, and she's very beautiful, very dark, and turquoise jewelry, and so on. And I kind of became mesmerized by her. And by the time dinner ended, or lunch ended, I had forgotten to tell her to go to college. So instead I wrote this poem about her. It's called Arizona Highways. I see her 17, a lady dark, turquoise on her wrists. The land, astounded by a sweeping rain, becomes her skin. Clouds begin to mend my broken eyes. I see her singing by a broken shack, eyes so black it must be dawn. I hum along, act sober, tell her I could love her if she dressed better, if her father got a job and beat her more. Eulinda, there's a name I could live with. I could thrash away the nuns, tell them I adopt this girl, dark, 17, silver on her fingers, in the name of the Father, Son, and me, the Holy Ghost. Why not? Mormons do less with less. Didn't her ancestors live in cliffs, no plumbing, just a lot of love and corn? Me, that's corn, pollen in her hair. East, south, west, north. Now I see my role, religious. The Indian politician made her laugh. Her silver jingled in her throat. Those songs, her fingers busy on his sleeve. Fathers, forgive me. She knows me in her chindi dream, always a little pale, too much bourbon in my nose, my shoes too clean, belly soft as hers. I'll move on. My schedule says many farms tomorrow, then on to Window Rock, and finally home, that weathered nude, distant as the cloud I came in on. This next poem is called In My Lifetime. Keith Browning was hoping that I would read some poems tonight because he says he can't understand them. And I think this is probably one of the ones he was talking about. This day the children of Speak Thunder run the wrong man, a saint unable to love a weasel way, able only to smile and drink the wind that makes the others go. Trees are ancient in his breath. His bleeding feet tell a story of run the sacred way, chase the antelope naked till it drops, the odor of run quiet in his blood. He watches cactus jump against the moon. Moon is speaking woman to the ancient fire, always woman. His sins were numerous, this wrong man. Buttes were good to listen from. With thunder hands his fathers shaped the dust, circled fire, tumbled up the wind to make a fool. Now the fool is dead. His bones go back, so scarred in time. The Buttes are young to look for signs that say a man could love his fate, that winter in the blood is one sad thing. His sins I don't explain. Desperate in my song, I run these woman hills, translate wind to mean a kind of life. The children of Speak Thunder are never wrong, and I am rhythm to strong medicine. Did you do Going to Remake This World as a broadside? Well, no, I've got it here. I just wondered. I'll read it if you did. Doesn't matter. This poem is called Going to Remake This World. And it has to do with my parents lived at Fort Belknap Agency on the Fort Belknap Reservation for a number of years. I lived there too. But I was going to school at Northern Montana, no, down at the University of Montana. And once I had to go home for Christmas break, which is really tough to do when home is kind of an out-of-the-way place like that. Everybody else is going to California and places like that. So at any rate, I wrote this poem about the experience called Going to Remake This World. Morning and the snow might fall forever. I keep busy. I watch the yellow dogs chase creeping cars filled with Indians on their way to the tribal office. Grateful trees tickle the busy underside of our snow-fat sky. My mind is right, I think, and you will come today for sure, this day when the snow falls. From my window, I see bundled Doris horsemen, black in the blowing snow, her raving son, Horace, too busy counting flakes to hide his face. He doesn't know. He kicks my dog and glares at me, too dumb to thank the men who keep him on relief and his mama drunk. My radio reminds me that Hawaii calls every afternoon at 2. Moose Jaw is overcast, 12 below and blowing. Some people. Listen, if you do not come this day, today of all days, there is another time when breeze is tropic and rifts the green sap forever up these crooked cottonwoods. Sometimes, you know, the snow never falls forever. Next one is a very short poem. It's called The Man from Washington. And I tried to imagine what it must have been like to be an Indian, Plains Indian, maybe a Blackfeet or a Assiniboine, Gros Ventre, whatever, and be summoned to a treaty grove like happened on the Missouri River. And there you were told what was going to happen to you. And this poem is called The Man from Washington. The end came easy for most of us, packed away in our crude beginnings, in some far corner of a flat world. We didn't expect much more than firewood and buffalo robes to keep us warm. The man came down, a slouching dwarf with rainwater eyes, and spoke to us. He promised that life would go on as usual, that treaties would be signed, and everyone, man, woman, and child, would be inoculated against a world in which we had no part, a world of money, promise, and disease. And I'd like to end this sort of mini poetry reading with a poem called Grandma's Man. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The grandfather in this poem is kind of a failed artist, and Grandma is more of a practical, realistic type person. I think that's all I need to say about it. It's called Grandma's Man. That day she threw the goose over the roof of the cowshed, put her hand to her lips and sucked, cursing. The world ended. In blood her world ended, though these past 20 years have healed the bite, and that silly goose is preening in her favorite pillow. Her husband was a fool. He laughed too long at lies told by girls whose easy virtue disappeared when he passed stumblebum down the Sunday street. Baled hay in his every 40, cows on his allotted range, his quick sorrel quarter horse, all neglected for the palms of friends. Then he began to paint life. His first attempt was all about a goose that bit the hand that fed it. The obstacles were great, insurmountable. His fingers were too thick to grip the brush right. The sky was always green, and hay spoiled in the fields. In wind, the rain, the superlative night, images came, geese skimming to the reservoir. This old man listened. He got a bigger brush and once painted the cry of a goose so long it floated off the canvas into thin air. Things got better. Sky turned white. Winter came, and he became quite expert at snowflakes. But he was growing wise, Lord, his hair white as snow. Funny, he used to say, how mountains are blue in winter and green in spring. He never ever got things quite right. He thought a lot about the day the goose bit Grandma's hand. Life seldom came the shade he wanted. Well, and yes, he died well, but you should have seen how well his friends took it. Oh, thanks. Thank you. The Indian lawyer is a man named Sylvester Yellowcalf, and he is a lawyer in Helena, Montana, the state capital. He's a lawyer with one of the more prestigious law firms in the city there. He came from very humble beginnings on the Blackfeet Reservation. He was raised by his grandparents. He didn't really know his own parents. And but he was a good, conscientious young man. He was a good student, And he's also a terrific basketball player. He was on two of Browning's state championship teams. He went on to the University of Montana, was an all-Big Sky player there, and eventually went on to Stanford Law School and finally up to Helena, where he's a lawyer. And the novel is he's also a member of the parole board, which I was for 10 years. And it's kind of one of those positions where you could get into a lot of trouble if you wanted to, or maybe even if you didn't want to. It's kind of a strange job to have. And during the course of this book, Sylvester does get into that kind of trouble. I won't tell you what it is. But at any rate, he has a girlfriend there in Helena. Her name is Shelley. And they're kind of on the verge of getting very serious. And here they're at a resort called Chico Hot Springs, which is a real place in Montana. Has the best food in Montana, or it did last time I was there. And what he's doing is he's thinking back about his basketball career, his college career, and then his high school career, and then about a guidance counselor named Lena Oldhorn, who was very influential in his life. But at any rate, here they are. This particular scene opens up with Shelley speaking. Isn't this the greatest place? Sylvester opened his eyes. He had fallen asleep on the too soft double bed. The early morning swim in the hot springs had exhausted him. God, I'd like to live here. I wonder if they need a maid or a horseshoe or something. I could live here forever, breathing this mountain air, swimming, eating in that wonderful dining room. They're so nice here. Sylvester raised his head. Shelley was sitting at the small desk near the window, writing a postcard. Who are you writing to? The girls. I promised them a postcard. They think Chico Hot Springs is like a desert outpost, so I'm sending this one. She held up a photograph of the resort with a snowy mountain in the background. This ought to disabuse them of that notion. She looked out the window for a moment, then returned to her writing. Sylvester closed his eyes again. He hadn't thought about that game with Boise State for a couple of years at least. It had been his final game, and when he recovered from the aches and bruises of a lifetime of basketball, he had concentrated on preparing for law school. He remembered that sports writer, Ray Lundeen. He covered all the games of Sylvester's college career for the Missoula newspaper. He'd covered a lot of Sylvester's high school games before that, when he'd been a reporter and columnist with the Great Falls Tribune before taking the Missoula job. He liked to think he knew Yellow Calf's insides better than any other sports fan, sports writer, coach, player, human being in the state of Montana. Sylvester's career had been a storied one, and he had told the story truly. Maybe he did and maybe he didn't, but he did have a profound effect on Sylvester's young life. It happened during Sylvester's senior year in high school. Browning had gone undefeated and was preparing for the state tournament. They had won it the year before and were all but conceded the championship this year. The same key players were back. They were all healthy, and they all loved to run. Racehorse basketball. That was the way of good Indian teams. They were exciting. They had fascinating names, and they played with such abandon that opponents were reduced eventually to just getting out of the way. That was the straight skinny, at least as Ray Lundeen knew it. He also knew that most of the white fans around the state, while professing great admiration and even contagious enthusiasm for these Indian teams, wouldn't offer the parents of these kids a cup of coffee in a snowstorm. That was the way of the world, as Ray Lundeen knew it. He had grown up in a Midwestern city and had followed the careers of many black players. He had watched them become stars, had stood in crowds honoring their parents at halftime, and had seen them all, with few exceptions, fade back into the obscurity and poverty of the ghetto. He had grown cynical and a bit caustic, a known curmudgeon even as a young reporter. His first job out of journalism school took him to Grand Forks, North Dakota. 2 years later, on a whim, he applied for a sports writing job in Great Falls. He wanted to sharpen his skills in a small city job before attacking the world of big-time journalism. The drawing card of the Great Falls job was the opportunity to write a weekly sports column, which he did for the next 7 years. It was about halfway through this tenure that he began to notice the name of Sylvester Yellowcalf in the basketball stories being sent down from the High Line. By this time, he had developed a consuming interest in Indian basketball teams. It had actually started in North Dakota when he covered the divisional and state tournaments and found himself having difficulty masking his bias in favor of Indian teams. In many ways, in their athletic ability, the way they carried themselves, the way they played the game, they reminded him of some of the black teams in his home city. And he noticed the curious phenomenon that occurred during these games on neutral courts. The fans of the teams not actually playing the Indian teams became caught up in the excitement of watching these players and rooted for them as enthusiastically as the reservation people. But Ray also noticed that when the game ended, there was almost no interchange between the two sets of fans. Quite often the only interchange was an act of hostility. And that hostility, disguised only by metaphor, extended into the newsroom. Once Ray mentioned his discovery to an older reporter on another newspaper. "It's like being in a monkey cage," the older man said. "At first you're surprised not only that they can perform their tricks, but how well they do it. But in the end, you're in a monkey cage, and people get mighty uneasy when they're surrounded by monkeys." The Browning team went 9-16 during Sylvester's sophomore year, 24-1 his junior year, and 25-0 his senior year. The only loss in that junior year was a forfeit to an arch rival when a Browning player on the bench got hit in the head with a full can of beer. An opposing player tried to wrestle Sylvester to the floor, but Sylvester pulled free and threw the player against the stage at the end of the court. By the time the lone policeman, the teachers, and the principal got the fans off the court, the floor was littered with objects and 2 Browning players were bleeding. The team was hustled off the court into the locker room to pick up their street clothes, then out to the bus. They put their clothes on over their wet uniforms as the bus lurched out of town, followed by 3 or 4 carloads of young men honking and shouting angry threats. But the next year there were no incidents between the two teams, either home or away, and Browning continued to win. They had won the State B championship the year before and were heavily favored to repeat. Sylvester ran the break and led the team in every category but rebounding. Even there he got more offensive rebounds, usually putbacks after one of his teammates missed. But he distributed the ball and they were a team every step of the way, until Ray Lundeen wrote the column in the Great Falls Tribune that changed everything. The column was in the form of a cautionary tale addressed to Sylvester Yellowcalf. "Dear Mr. Yellowcalf," it began, "you are the heart and soul of the greatest Indian basketball team this state has seen. You have provided thrills and chills in one way or another to every basketball fan in Montana, and for that we thank you." It was not a great column, for Ray Lundeen was only a competent writer. But as the column went on, it became oddly effective, a sort of paean to all the teams and players who came out of the ghetto or from the reservation to provide momentary pleasure, excitement, diversion to the faceless, pitiful hordes who live in the shadow of the bomb. Montana was the 5th biggest nuclear power in the world, he pointed out. who lead lives of quiet desperation, of bankruptcy and foreclosure, of night sweats and trembling. Many of your teammates, Sylvester, will have had their brief moment in the sun and will fall by the wayside, perhaps to a life of drink and degradation, so much a part of Indian experience. But you must carry the torch. And the column went on to praise Sylvester's leadership, intelligence, work ethic, politeness. He ended by calling Sylvester a winner, both on the court and off, in the past, present, and future in life. A winner for all minorities who fight the endless battle for respect and honor. The principal had tacked the article up on the bulletin board outside his office. Word spread, and soon several players were standing at the bulletin board, joking and jostling, looking for their own names. But as they read, they became quiet and motionless. They didn't say much to each other as they made their way to study hall, but they were all thinking the same thing. They had been presented in their youth with a vision of themselves that they might have thought about briefly and offhandedly. They had seen it, the ex-jocks who slept in their clothes, in cars and doorways, who tried to bum quarters off them as they passed on their way to practice. Some of these had been uncles, cousins, even in one case, a father. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that Sylvester had been exempted from that vision, that he was a winner who would go on to better things. Practice that afternoon appeared normal. There was the usual thumping and screeching of basketball shoes, grunting, yelling, the steady pound of basketball on hardwood as the sides drove up and down the court. There was also a surprising lack of horseplay, grabbing jerseys, tugging on trunks, fake passes, and circus shots. The coach did not yell at them, as he usually did, for roughhousing because there was none. To all appearances, it was a good, hard practice by a good, disciplined team. But the character of it had changed, and Sylvester noticed. He had read the column, and that day he felt mostly embarrassment and regret that his teammates had not gotten their fair share of credit. He did not feel that it was a big deal. He had been the main subject of all the stories about the team. Though he was intelligent, even bright, he was too young to understand the way his teammates, and later their parents and relatives and friends, would take this particular story. He did not feel that he was that much different from the others. They were all smart, athletic, spirited. They would all make it. They would prove to this Ray Lundeen that they were all winners. But the seed of incipient hostility had been planted, and most of the players were made to feel that they had ridden on Sylvester Yellowcalf's coattails this far. More than one wondered that day if he would be one of those destined to fall by the wayside. What made matters worse, each of them had plenty of examples within his own family, within his family's circle of friends, of young men of potential who had failed, often miserably. What did make these boys different was that up to the point of the article, they had determined to succeed, to rise above, as their guidance counselor often suggested. The irony in this was that they looked to Sylvester, who had been raised in the bald poverty of Moccasin Flat by grandparents, as an example of rising above. They knew that his parents were no good. His mother a barfly who had left a long time ago. His father a wino who had drifted off a long time ago too. Their parents had told them terrible stories about Sylvester's family. Somehow those stories made him one of them, in spite of his stardom. Now they felt betrayed by this paragon of virtue, who would almost guarantee their failure by his success. But they did not fail in basketball. They were too good a team to come apart in the state tournament. In fact, they played the best ball of their lives, and in the title game, when the starters began coming out, with a little over 3 minutes left, The 5,000-plus fans gave them standing ovations. Sylvester was the last to come out, and all the players on the bench gave him the power shake. A couple smiled. One said we blew their asses out. But it was a subdued group that watched the final seconds tick away. Afterward, in the locker room, they said a prayer in Blackfeet. Then the coach told them what they had accomplished as a team. He emphasized team. But as he looked around the hot, grimy room, he knew that they were not really listening. Already the term had taken on a distant sound. He had grown up in Browning, too. As he finished his little speech, he looked directly at Sylvester, who sat at the end of the bench with his head down. The coach did not feel the usual fatherly pride toward his star player. Instead, he felt a strange mixture of resentment and pity. The young man still had a long road to travel. Sylvester had already signed a letter of intent to play for the University of Montana Grizzlies because he wanted to be within driving distance of his grandparents and because the school had a good Division I basketball program. Mostly, Sylvester wanted to get into a school with a decent pre-law program. He had made up his mind that he wanted to at least see if he could hack law studies. He had read an article in a magazine that the guidance counselor had given him about Indian lawyers. The article called them the New Warriors and predicted that Indian law and water law, both of which figured prominently on reservations, were the fields to choose in the 70s and 80s. The guidance counselor, a young woman named Lena Oldhorn, who had thought about a law career herself and still hadn't given up on the notion, told Sylvester that he had the talent and dedication to be one of these new warriors. After basketball season, Sylvester grew apart from his teammates, even from Donnie Little Dog, who had to quit the team after his parents were killed in a car accident. The team had dedicated their season to Donnie and his family, and he had sat on the bench with the players during the state tournament. He and Sylvester had grown up together on Moccasin Flat, had fought, fished, hunted, played basketball, run track, studied together, even chased girls together, although the girl Sylvester wanted was Donnie's sister, who was a year younger than they were. She was a shy girl who ended up taking care of the family until family services took most of them away. After that, she sank inward into a quiet despondency. She endured Sylvester's teasing attention, but did nothing to encourage it. After Donnie drifted away, Sylvester was basically alone. He decided to skip track that spring in order to concentrate on his studies. With Lena Oldhorn's help, he took 2 courses at the Blackfeet Community College, one an English course taught by a young instructor named Stanley Weintraub. He was from back east and wore his hair in a ponytail and had a small gold earring in his ear. He was not a stranger to Montana, having worked 3 years ago on the Flathead Reservation as a VISTA volunteer. But that was west of the mountains, near the university town of Missoula. He had made a lot of friends over there, had occasionally sat in on poetry classes at the university. Weintraub was a pretty good poet, and he'd hoped to be able to teach poetry at the community college. But there was something about the attitude of the college, the town, the whole reservation, that made Weintraub hesitant, almost fearful. His way of treating Indians as dead-level equals, not to be deferred to, not to be condescending toward, but to be looked at straight in the eye, did not seem to work here. There was a structure among these people that Weintraub did not understand, much less fit into. And so he became fast friends with Lena Oldhorn, one of the other outsiders in town. It did not bother Lena that she was an outsider. She had expected it. It would be the same for an outsider on her own reservation. She tried to explain this to Stan, and when it wouldn't sink in, she let it go and did her job at the high school. But when Sylvester Yellowcalf came into her office one late afternoon and asked her what a person would have to do to get a law degree, her heart had actually skipped a couple of beats. As he sat there, so tall and handsome in his letterman's jacket, she thought he had been sent to her by a spirit guide. She had heard of him, of course. She went to all the home games with Stan. She talked with his teachers. She knew he lived with his grandparents on Moccasin Flat. There were a few secrets a star basketball player could keep in Browning. But to have him come to her and ask about the study of law was too good to be true. Lena talked with him for an hour, then gave him the article about the new breed of Indian lawyers. There was nothing really personal in their discussion. She was the guidance counselor and he the student. But when he left, she found herself trying to remember if she had given him any encouragement other than professional. She was almost ashamed because she hoped she had. She hoped he wanted to see her again as much as she wanted to see him. After that first time, he did come again. He came at least once a week, usually after classes, and they talked of different law schools, the advantages and disadvantages of each. She lent him her own brochures and catalogs, and he took them home and read them assiduously. A couple of times he seemed overwhelmed by the unfathomable jargon of the law, but she coaxed him back and restored his confidence. By spring, they were friends. He took Lena and Stan fishing at Mission Lake and Four Horns Reservoir. He had to teach them everything, but they were fast learners, and soon they were all catching fish. Later in the evening, Stan would fry them up, while Lena and Sylvester talked at Lena's kitchen table. Only once did things become outwardly awkward. The night Lena asked him about his parents. He had always been so outgoing and polite that she was startled by the way his jaw became rigid. He did not look up from his plate of fish and potatoes. He said that his mother had another family somewhere in New Mexico, and his father had been seen a few years ago in Butte. Then he laughed and said they weren't his real parents anyway. Lena did not know what he meant, but she changed the subject. She had shamed him deeply in front of Stan, a white man, an outsider. She should have known better, but she had been taken in by his image as a star athlete, an honor student, a role model to all the kids around Browning. She should have known that he was as inwardly timid and vulnerable as any youth who had been abandoned, cast aside by those he loved the most. She had seen lots of kids on her own reservation being raised by grandparents. Sylvester seemed different from them, but she knew he wasn't, and she should have known better than to ask him about his family in front of an outsider. She also knew that for him, she was no longer an outsider, and this pleased her more than anything in her life at that moment. He would have answered her truly and fully had they been alone. She knew this deep down, but she also knew she would never bring up his parents again. As for Sylvester, he was in love and confused. He knew that Lena and Stan were more than just friends. He had seen on the grassy banks of Four Horns Reservoir, with the brilliant sun greening up the prairie around them, Stan put his arm around Lena, and it seemed natural out there. In town, in school, one seldom saw teachers, even married ones, touch each other. Sylvester smiled at such intimacy when he saw it, because it made the teachers human, just like the kids. And he liked being with Lena and Stan because it made him feel grown up, even though his grandmother didn't particularly like it. She pointed out that he was neglecting his own people by hanging around with them. Sylvester didn't argue. He couldn't tell her that his own people seemed to have grown away from him ever since the state tournament back in March. His teammates remained distantly friendly, but they never invited Sylvester to pick up games or Saturday nights of driving around. Most were involved with track, so he hardly ever saw them after school, except at a distance when he sometimes watched them practice on the football field. The people in town smiled and greeted him. A few even asked if he was going to start for the Grizzlies next winter, or if he was staying in shape. But there was none of the old banter, the fond teasing he had grown up with. In less than 2 months, Sylvester had become a different person. He had always been a little different. He studied hard. He took care of his grandparents as much as they took care of him. He didn't drink at all. He was always the best athlete, even as a little kid. But now, without dwelling on it, he knew he had become an outsider to all but the old people. He still went places with his grandmother and grandfather, to honoring ceremonies, to giveaways, to namings, and the elders treated him with kindness and respect. But he did feel that he was becoming distant from these old people and their ceremonies as well. So that left Lena and Stan. Stan tried to interest Sylvester in poetry, both the reading and the writing of it. But all Sylvester wanted to learn from Stan was how to write a clear sentence, how to put his thoughts into words that would be understandable to that great world out there. In fact, Sylvester was not a bad writer. He would do well in college. So Stan taught him the form of the essay and had him writing on everything from the scalp dance to the Watts riots. He also became Sylvester's sparring mate on the basketball court behind the elementary school. Although at 5'10", he was 5 inches shorter than Sylvester, he was surprisingly quick and aggressive and not afraid to throw a hip or an elbow. He couldn't shoot, and he was a terrible dribbler, but he was a flailing, hacking machine on defense, and Sylvester needed that kind of practice. But Sylvester found himself becoming increasingly annoyed at Stanley Weintraub. He couldn't figure it out. It wasn't because of the way Stan played, or because of the frequent chewing outs he gave Sylvester over his essays. It was something else. It was Lena. Sylvester was in love with Lena in a way that a youth falls in love with a special aunt. And Sylvester resented Stan in the way a youth might resent the uncle who treated his wife with a kind of loving indifference. Sylvester had never been close enough to husbands and wives, to aunts and uncles, to lovers, to know why he felt this way. He had known girlfriends, longing, jealousy, but those feelings were not complicated and eventually resolved themselves with time and new girlfriends and new seasons of basketball. What he felt toward Lena was not quite sexual, even though he found her very attractive. Her small, slender body and wide face with high cheekbones suggested vulnerability and strength. He could see her 100 years ago in buckskins and shawl, doing beadwork or dancing a grants dance with other women. But her hair was long and soft, slightly curled under at her shoulders, fashionable. Once in her office, he stood leaning over her shoulder, following her finger across a course description, and he almost put his hand on her shoulder. It was a reflex action, the way he leaned into a huddle, watching the coach diagram a play on the floor. His hand was inches from her shoulder when he caught himself. He had never touched her because she was an authority figure in school. He had shaken hands with teachers when they congratulated him over something, but he had never initiated the contact. Lena had looked up at that instant, brushed her long hair away from her face, and her eyes were expectant. Now Sylvester felt that had he rested his hand on her shoulder, their relationship would have changed, and he was both sad and glad that he hadn't. He didn't know what he wanted from Lena, and so he often became annoyed with Stan for his easy, possessive way around her. The day Sylvester broke Stan's nose was a cold, blustery, sleety mid-May Sunday. After almost a month of warm sunshine, the day caught Browning by surprise. People were still raking old leaves, planting gardens, washing cars, playing softball in the driving sleet from the north. The wind chill plunged to 10 above, and the mountains a few miles to the west disappeared, and still the people refused to go inside, as though ancestral rhythms told them spring was the time to go outside and stay outside. Sylvester thought about that day often, remembering all the details, the way the rope clanked against the flagpole at the elementary school, the sting of the driven sleet across his cheek. Stan was playing his usual aggressive game, the one Sylvester had put up with all spring to toughen himself up for college ball. It happened very quickly, but Sylvester saw it all the way. He was backing into the pivot, backing the flailing poet off the ball, when Stan caught Sylvester with a knuckle in the back. Nothing unusual, nothing to get upset about, and Sylvester wasn't. He simply pivoted toward the basket with his left elbow out, and he saw almost simultaneously Stan drop to his knee and the ball go into the chainless hoop. Sylvester drove Stan up to the PHS hospital in Stan's old Volkswagen bus. The sleet was almost too thick to see through, and the road up the hill was slick, but they made it and walked into the emergency area just as a doctor was about to leave. Stan held a handkerchief tenderly against his nose, but the blood seeped down his sweatshirt, staining, almost obliterating, the Rutgers across his chest. Sylvester waited for 2 hours in the darkening waiting room, looking at dog-eared but barely read magazines. He thought about calling Lena, but what would he say? I wrecked your lover's nose because I want you for myself. Yes, it was deliberate. Yes, I saw it happen, heard the pop, saw the blood, and made the layup. Yes, I like Stan, but I hate him too. I want him to leave you alone, not touch you or kiss you when he thinks I'm not looking. But I don't know what I want from you, except for you to give me all of your attention, to look at me, to touch me, to help me. Sylvester drove Stan home, then walked back to his grandparents' house on Moccasin Flat. The area was beginning to be surrounded by government housing, but his grandparents lived in the old section, in a house of plywood and tar paper and boards and plastic-covered windows. The daffodils, which his grandmother had planted on each side of the door, were bent under the weight of the sleet. Sylvester shook each one, brushed off the sleet, then entered the house. As he ate the deer meat stew and fry bread, he watched his grandparents watch television. They could get only 2 channels, neither very clearly, but they watched every night until bedtime, his grandmother working on a star quilt, his grandfather rolling cigarettes and laughing deep in his chest. Sylvester wondered, as he often did when he studied his grandparents, what his mother looked like. There were no pictures of her around the house. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.